like to thank the board of directors at Healthcare Workers with Climate Action for sponsoring this, for their time, the funding they find, and their passion for this work in New Hampshire. They make these kind of conversations possible. But I also want to especially thank Wes Tater from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, who helped organize this, and Emily Thompson from Bedford, who is currently in the DC area. Takes a lot of people to put together events, and they did a great job moving it forward. So I'll say one other thing about myself, because why am I here? Right? I mean, public health, yes, and this is a health issue, but I really believe in political centrism. I'm a proud independent voter in New Hampshire. That means I'm ready to listen to and vote any politician on either side with good ideas, backed up by evidence, a realistic plan to get it done within ethical and constitutional bounds. We're going to hear today one of those good ideas, review some of that evidence, and consider the implications. And as a segue, I'll quote Winston Churchill, who says, goes something like, excuse me, if you're not a liberal when you're young, you have no imagination. If you're not a conservative when you're older, you have no sense. And that spirit will listen and learn from each other, respect in different ways. Now, onto Congressman Inglis. Many of you probably read his introduction, but it's helpful to get a reminder that he is the executive director of republicEn. But before that, he was elected to the U.S. Congress in 1992, having never run for office before. He represented Greenville-Spartanburg, South Carolina from 1993 to 98, and again in 2004 to 2011. In 2011, he went full-time into promoting free enterprise action on climate change. In 2014, he founded republicEn, a growing grassroots community of over 10,000 Americans educating the country about free enterprise solutions to climate change. The organization is hosted by George Mason University, educates, recruits, and organizes conservative voices for action on climate change. He and his wife, Mary Anne, have 5 children. They live on a small farm in northern Greenville, in South Carolina. So, Bob, we want to thank you for taking the time to visit New Hampshire virtually and learn about some of our issues here. I tried to give you a little bit of feedback earlier today about what we're thinking. Obviously, a primary state, one of the early primary states. So, Bob, take it away and tell us more.
Well, thank you, Matt, for the opportunity to be here. I must confess, I feel a little bit like an imposter because the Robert Inglis that you really want on for a health discussion is my son, who, with the Vermonters on here, he's actually in Burlington, Vermont, as an emergency room physician, and his wife, who is from Vermont, is in public health or has a master's in public health. So really, they're the two you should be talking to for this particular topic. But so I'll be the imposter, seeing friends like Wes there, and so we'll just carry on as in my imposter status here. Let me start with a scenario for you. So I'm Inglis Industries, let's say. I wish, but let's say I'm Inglis Industries, and I make a good and useful product to society. But I burn a lot of stuff in order to make that product. I create a fair amount of soot. Some of that ends up in my neighbor's lungs. Most of them cough it up. Some of them go to the hospital with asthma and whatever. Those neighbors are usually poor and disproportionately of color because the residential real estate near my plant is the cheaper real estate in town. And meanwhile, across town, I've got a competitor. Her process is a lot cleaner. She's got the new equipment. She doesn't burn a lot of stuff. She doesn't foul her neighbor's lungs. She doesn't create the other problem that I'm creating, not locally, but worldwide, which is in my burning, I create a lot of CO2, and I end up creating climate change around the world or contributing to that. She doesn't. But here's the thing. I beat her every day in the marketplace because her new equipment has a bank loan attached to it. My old sort of lousy but getting by equipment is long ago paid off. And I'm just getting economic rent out of Inglis Industries. It's really a great deal for me, pretty good deal for my customers too, because they get a cheap widget. If I weren't in business, they'd have to buy from my competitor, and her widget is just a little bit more expensive. Does the same thing or meets the same need, but I beat her every day in the marketplace. And so the question is, what would you do about that? And it's a little bit unruly maybe on Zoom to ask this question, but if we were in person, I'd be interested in hearing the responses about what do you do about that? And I think there are several. One is, and we'll get into this in a second, but I want you to be thinking about this. One is you could regulate Inglis Industries. Consider that. Another possibility is you could give tax credits to my competitor to make her more competitive with me. Think about that. Or the third possibility is you could just charge me for dumping into the trash dump of the sky. And so on that, what I hope you'll think about is it possible that in America we could decide to untax, say, payroll income and tax pollution instead? So be thinking about that. So Inglis Industries, the scenario with me beating my competitor, maybe she gets tax credits, maybe you regulate me, maybe you just charge me for dumping into the trash dump of the sky. So be thinking about those scenarios. We'll come back to those. But now, before I wanted to give you the scenario before I poison it with my own views here. You know, I didn't want to poison the sample. So yeah, the thing that I probably need to address right off is, Inglis, how did you get to this, man? You're supposedly a conservative from South Carolina, and you're all hepped up on climate. Don't you know this is a liberal cause? Well, that's what I thought for my first 6 years in Congress. I didn't know anything about it really, except that Al Gore was for it. And in as much as he was for it, I was against it. Okay, I admit that's pretty ignorant, but that's the way it was my first 6 years in Congress. Then I was out of Congress 6 years doing commercial real estate law in Greenville, South Carolina. Had the opportunity to run for the same seat again. Back then we had 6 U.S. House seats in South Carolina. We've grown so much now, we've got 7. But had the opportunity to run for the same seat again in 2004. That's the year that son that's now practicing emergency medicine in Burlington had just turned 18. So he was voting for the first time. He came to me and said, Dad, I'll vote for you, but you're going to clean up your act on the environment. His 4 sisters agreed. His mother agreed. That's a new constituency. So that was step 1 of a 3-step metamorphosis. And by the way, my son was going to vote for me no matter what, right? It wasn't in his economic interest to vote against me. It is possible to lose by 1 vote. I think what he's really saying was, Dad, I love you, and you can be better than you were before. So how about make this Inglis 2.0, the new and improved version? So that was step 1. Step 2 is going to Antarctica with a science committee and seeing the evidence in the ice core drillings. Amazing record of the Earth's atmosphere in the desert that is Antarctica. So saw the science there. That was step 2. Step 3 was another science committee trip and something of a spiritual awakening, which seems unlikely, right, on a godless science committee trip, because we all know that all scientists are godless. Well, apparently not, because this Aussie climate scientist who I was snorkeling with was showing me the Great Barrier Reef and the challenge of coral bleaching, and I could see that he was worshiping God in what he was showing me. It was in his eyes, it was written all over his face, it was in his excitement about what he was showing me. St. Francis of Assisi supposedly said, I don't know if he actually said it, but supposedly said, preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words. And so Scott Heron, who's now become a very dear friend, was preaching the gospel without any words. And I heard it. Later, we had a chance to use words. And he told me about conservation changes he was making in his life to love God and love people. People will come after us. He rides his bike to work, does without air conditioning as much as possible in Townsville, Australia, pretty hot place. Hangs the family's clothes out on the line, all to consciously love people coming after us. So I got right inspired. I want to be like Scott, loving God and loving people. So I came home and introduced the Raise Wages, Cut Carbon Act of 2009. Probably not the best political timing to introduce a carbon tax in the midst of the Great Recession, when you represent perhaps the reddest district of the reddest state of the nation. After 12 years in Congress, I got 29% of the vote in a Republican primary runoff. The other guy got the other 71% of the vote. Rather spectacular faceplants, in politics. You usually don't lose that badly unless you've been indicted or something. I hadn't been indicted, but I was just on the wrong side of Tea Party orthodoxy. And so at that point, the foundation came to me and said, Inglis, you're an unusual zoo animal, an actual conservative, 93 American Conservative Union rating, 100% Christian Coalition, 100% National Right to Life, A with the NRA, 0 with the Americans for Democratic Action, that's a liberal group, and 23 by some mistake with the AFL-CIO, the labor union. I was really hoping for a 0. I don't know how I got a 23. So they said, an actual conservative, will you speak and write for the proposition? And so that's what I'm doing ever since. It's now this thing called republicEn.org. It's EN for energy, entrepreneurship, the environment. We're conservatives who care about climate change. And we're out to convince conservatives to get in this conversation. And so that's how I got to this. So now back to that Inglis Industries scenario, and just to quickly run through those policy options that I was actually laying out. And again, if we were in person, I might have gone around the room and waited until I heard somebody say regulate Inglis Industries, somebody say do some clean energy credits, and maybe somebody from my friends at Citizens Climate Lobby say something about a carbon tax. So those are really the 3 ways you could deal with it, right? So take the first one. Why we regulate Inglis Industries? I mean, Inglis is over there. I'm up dumping stuff into the sky. I'm soot and small particulates and CO2. You could regulate me. That could work. But the question is whether it would affect the worldwide situation. The risk you run in this regulatory approach, seems to me, is if you regulate Inglis Industries here in America, I may just pick up and move my operations to a country, a jurisdiction where they don't regulate, in which case we might have just gone downhill on solving climate change, because once I get to, say, to China or Vietnam or someplace like that, we're way more energy efficient than they are. And so the CO2 I'm producing here is less than I would produce if I were manufacturing in a jurisdiction like China. So, but in fairness to people that would choose the regulatory approach, it would do good things. I mean, it would fewer asthma cases. I'm speaking to healthcare professionals. It would be fewer asthma cases because Inglis Industries would have to scrub its stack better, maybe sequester its CO2. These things could improve the health situation here in America. In fact, and I take out the could, would improve the health situation here in America. But as to whether they'd solve climate change, I'm not sure, because you can't regulate Chinese emissions from here in America. Second possibility is to help my competitor, the gal across town who has the cleaner equipment, give her some tax credits. That'd work. That's what we're doing in the Inflation Reduction Act. We're giving her a bunch of credits, and they're powerful, and they probably are going to work to deploy a lot of technology like hers. because those credits work if you're an American tax-paying company. Problem is, if you're a Chinese company, you don't pay American taxes. So credits in the American tax system don't mean anything to you and do not affect your economics. Because, that's essentially what you're doing in a credit. If you're going to reduce taxes, one way to do it is reduce rates. The other way to do it is to increase exemptions, deductions, or credits. And so these credits will work to incentivize behavior here in America among American tax-paying firms. But again, the question is, will our trading partners in Vietnam or China or Bangladesh be similarly incentivized? And the answer pretty clearly no, through the American tax code. Now, the best response to that is to, but early adoption here is going to result in cost reductions that are going to make that technology affordable in Bangladesh and Vietnam and China. To which I would say, I sure hope so, but I don't know so. Because if you take the power sector, for example, relatively few firms in the world that make electricity for customers, maybe 20, 30,000 firms in the whole world that make electricity for customers. That's a small market. You generally have price sticks in small markets. Compare that to the cell phone market, where, mass market, 8 billion people would like to have a cell phone in their pocket. Even the babies would probably like to look at the cell phone. And so probably not a good idea. I'm talking to health professionals. I agree with that. You don't really want babies looking at those machines. But and you'll be happy to know that my son does not. They're not interested in their 2-year-old looking at that machine. Anyway, but 8 billion people would like to have a cell phone. And that means that the price comes down because people supplying that market are trying to sell a lot of units at low margins. But if you got a small market, you generally have boutique pricing and it's a low volume, high margin. So if that's right, we may not get those cost crashes. And again, we might end up in a situation where, we have fewer asthma cases here in America, longer life expectancy, fewer hospitalizations, really pretty good stuff as a result of these clean energy credits. But if we don't get the technology around the world, we're not solving climate change, because the devilish problem about climate change is emissions anywhere or climate change everywhere. And that, by the way, is now the most common objection that I find among the people that we're trying to reach, fellow conservatives. It was, back when I was getting tossed out of Congress, this aggressive unbelief. I don't believe in climate change, you shouldn't either, was the Tea Party mantra, and around about 2010, 11, 12. But now, as my friend Catherine Hayhoe likes to say, people have stopped arguing with thermometers so much, and they realize we got a problem. But now it's more, how do you get the world in on this? And that's where those two solutions for the Inglis Industries scenario are falling short, seems to me. You regulate me, I might end up moving my operations to a non-regulatory place. You give me clean energy incentives, well, that would work for Inglis Industries. But will it solve climate change? Because you're not affecting the economics of Chinese companies, for example. So that leads me to, now that I've dissed 1 and 2, obviously I'm in favor of number 3, because it's also what you could guess from the Raise Wages, Cut Carbon Act. I'm out to prove that really is a good idea. I'm still, I got tossed out of Congress, but I'm still after that same idea. And so the idea basically is to untax payroll and put a tax on carbon dioxide instead. Essentially charging Inglis Industries a tipping fee for the trash dump. I'm pretty sure that whatever community you live in charges trash haulers a tipping fee when they bring a dump truck full of stuff to the city dump or the county dump. because that is a user fee that conservatives agree with and progressives agree with. It just makes sense. Well, otherwise, you're subsidizing a trash hauler's operations. And in fact, you might even get out-of-state trash brought to your dump. If you can dump for free, there'll be a lot of people bringing to your dump. But if you charge them a tipping fee, they bring less. And you need to charge a tipping fee because the city's going to have to build a new dump when the current one fills up. And so the idea is pay as you go, user fee, rock solid conservatism, agreeable to progressives as well. So you charge me that tipping fee. Say it's a carbon tax. That's a hard word. That's the hard part. Everybody that knows about politics here, you asked me to address politics. That's a hard thing to say a carbon tax. Oh, Inglis, wait a minute, you're a conservative and you're talking about a new tax? What are you talking about? Have you taken leave of your senses? Well, yeah, it's a tax, but it's really an untax, isn't it? I mean, it's like untaxed payroll, tax carbon pollution instead. So, payroll tax is 6.2% for the employee. So there's some gal working at McDonald's tonight, somewhere maybe near you. It's her second or third job. She's paying 6.2% tonight on what she's making. It comes out in a FICA box on her paycheck. McDonald's Corporation is paying the other 6.2%. It is a whopping 12.4% tax on that second or third job she's got. You reduce that tax, you put on a carbon tax, and the Congressional Budget Office says the bottom 70% of Americans do better because they get a fuller paycheck and they can avoid the carbon tax. How? Well, by driving less, by turning down the thermostat, by putting plastic on the windows in the winter, by doing things that conserve their energy use. They can avoid the carbon tax and they got the fuller paycheck. But mostly what it would do is spur innovation in new products, because at that point, cleaner would appear cheaper on the shelves, not because of subsidies, not because Inglis Industries got regulated, but simply because Inglis Industries just got made accountable in a tipping fee into the trash dump of the sky. And so my widget would now come to its more accurate true cost, the societal cost built into my product, rather than hidden in my neighbor's lungs and in Bangladesh or wherever I'm causing the trouble with the CO2. And so now I'd be accountable for that. And it'd be on my product. And comparatively, my competitor's product would appear cheaper on the shelves. And people would buy her stuff rather than mine. That stinks for me at that point. But what I need to do is innovate, right? I need to figure out, well, I can go buy the same equipment she's got and try to compete with her then on a level playing field. And we think that's something that really makes sense it just generally makes sense, but it fits with what conservatives generally think of themselves. They are people who believe in accountability, who believe not in government handouts, who believe, in level playing fields. And so that's what we think it could be. Now, the bill that I had, the Raise Wages, Cut Carbon Act of 2009, was a $15 per ton price on carbon dioxide emitted, rising to $100 a ton over 30 years' time. But I was always happy to go higher or differently than in the trajectory on that tax if you just gave me the corresponding FICA tax reduction, because as long as you're going to cut the taxes somewhere else and not grow the government, that's fine with me as a conservative, right? And so that's what we're out to convince conservatives of. And to give you some numbers there, you probably know these, but if a $30 per ton price on carbon dioxide at the mine, at the pipeline, in other words, an upstream application, very simple job for the IRS. Less than 2,000 companies either mine coal or put stuff in a pipeline in America. So it's a very small job for the IRS. You put on the $30 per ton price, There's no accounting for anybody downstream about the carbon tax, no record keeping required. It's just when I at Inglis Industries go fill up my delivery van, I'm paying 30 cents more a gallon at the gas pump with a $30 per ton price on carbon dioxide. That's what it works out to. If it's $40 a ton, it's 40 cents a gallon at the local gas station. And if it's $30 a ton, the average home, it goes up by about $11 a month on its electricity bill. Not catastrophic for many people, but for some people, like that gal working that third job at McDonald's, it's pretty serious because she may live far away from that McDonald's in cheaper real estate. She's got to drive there, and 30 cents a gallon is serious. Particularly, we're used to 30-cent fluctuations, but this would be 30 cents up and staying up. And so that being the case, you've got to address the regressivity of the carbon tax. And that is the best argument against a carbon tax is it hurts poor people. That's why it's so important, I think, for conservatives, especially, to immediately address the regressivity problem and say, well, we got to deal with that. And one very fine way to do it is to cut the payroll tax, because then you end up, like I say, with the bottom 70% of Americans doing better, says the Congressional Budget Office. And here I am banging on, and I could show you some Milton Friedman quotes, and if you go to our website, you'll see it's all in red, and if you're a progressive and you're thinking, he's banging on all this conservative language, but it sure sounds familiar. Might be, because it's the same thing that Al Gore has been for about 30 years. I asked him a couple years ago if I could keep on saying that. He said, well, hold up, Bob. If you're talking a low, I said, no, sir, I'm talking a substantial price on carbon dioxide that's steadily rising. He said, well, fine then. Yes, you can tell people that what you're for is what I've been for about 30 years. And so our ultimate hope at republicEn.org is to bring America together. I mean, we message to the right, to conservatives, people right of center, because we want them to hear it in their own language from people who like them and who agree with them on many things. And then if we can get them then thinking that, hey, we got a solution. Yes, we do. We got a solution. How about you? They can say across a middle school gym in Spirit Week, then maybe we can have America come together and lead the world to solutions. So that's my story. That's my song. So that's how I got to this. And I gave you the scenario of Inglis Industries, and we ran through the 3 ways you can fix the problem that I'm causing at Inglis Industries. You can regulate me, you can incentivize me, or you can just charge me a tipping fee for dumping in the trash dump of the sky. And if you want to address the regressivity, you can reduce payroll taxes while you're at it. So there's no growth of government. It's pretty conservative, we think, but it's also good that it happens to make Al Gore happy. And I long for the day when my party is populated by people who aren't so miserable as to think that the only way that their misery can somehow be lessened is if our enemies are writhing in agony on the floor. But rather that maybe we could say, it's okay if our enemies, not really enemies, the people that are often wrong, are smiling while we're smiling for very different reasons. So that's the ultimate hope. So let me stop there and see what questions or comments you've got. I'm interested in your comments and your suggestions as well as your questions.
Yes, we're going to launch into that now. Bob, thank you for your insights on the free market solutions. I want to talk later about the Inglis Industries Beijing office. But before that, I want to, I think you could get there by taking on one of the questions. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about kind of housekeeping here. We can read them off of the chat. It's not as interesting and exciting for me. Or we can open up audio. If you want to raise your hand, we'll unmute you and you can tell us what you think. Just a reminder, if your comments get very long-winded, we'll hit the buzzer and remind you to actually ask a question. So questions are key. He had a great presentation, a lot of interesting food for thought there. So if anybody's raising their hand right now, Emily, we'll open it up to them. Otherwise, I'll go to the chat and I'll select one that kind of, I think, segues well off of where you were going. All right, I'm not hearing anything, so I'm going to ask you a question.
Actually, sorry, Matt. Curtis has his real hand raised, so I can pass it over to him.
Great.
Oh, sorry, I didn't do that. Well, thank you for the idea of presenting a carbon tax. And your idea of eliminating the FICA tax, which is a tax on all income earned by all Americans, is a unique thought that I hadn't thought of. You know, I'm a member of Citizens Climate Lobby. I don't know how many people on this call are, and we've advocated for a revenue check every month back to Americans to cover the amount of revenue generated. And so my first question is that, are you inherently opposed to the revenue redistribution by giving it to everybody? And if so, why not? Though I suspect you can't really maybe trust government to not put their hand in the till, but that's, you know, kind of my gut feeling on that. And the second thing is to just comment on the thing that George Shultz says, that if government doesn't keep the money, is it really a tax? So that's just two thoughts. So.
Yeah. So if I read tomorrow morning that a miracle had happened in Congress late at night, had passed a dividend plan that Citizens Climate Lobby supports, I'd be very happy. That's great. It's a great way to recycle the revenue, just like recycling through the FICA tax. You know, I think it has the advantage, the CCL dividend approach has the advantage of creating that would then support steadily rising carbon taxes, and that's a good thing. So, because they do need to rise over time, they can't be static because of the substitution effect. We can get into that if you want to, but so. And then on the second thing about George Shultz, yeah, I think that's, I wish for people to believe, you and me, Curtis, that that it is not a tax if it's going back immediately to the people, to the citizenry. I think that we'll have many opponents who say, no, it's a tax. Anytime you compel something, it's a tax. So some people like to say, why do you call it a tax? Why do you, Inglis, admit that it's a carbon tax? Shouldn't you call it a fee or something? We just go ahead and admit it's a tax, because a fee by any other name, if it's compelled, is the same thing as a tax. And so I've got a lot of conservative friends that would, you know, stomp us with both feet if we didn't go ahead and admit it was a tax. But it's a tax that's paired with a equal reduction in other taxes or a dividend of all the money back to the citizenry. And that means there's no growth of government. And full disclosure, by the way, I'm on the board of Citizens Climate Education. That's a 501c3 that supports CCL. So we're thick as thieves with CCL.
All right. Well, I don't see any hands up, but I think a good segue talking about that is Joan Widmer. There you go.
Yeah, I have two questions. One, I'm sure you get all the time is, and I see it in the chat also, is, you know, how we fund Social Security if there's no FICA tax. But my second question is, how's the traction going with conservatives on this issue?
Great. Two questions. Yes. One, the FICA tax does in fact support Social Security. What we'd be doing here is changing it so that its funding source is a broad-based consumption tax, which I think you can make the case that it makes Social Security a little bit more stable. Arguably, consumption goes down during recessions, but so does employment. So I think that's if it doesn't improve it, it's a wash of making it. It's a broad-based consumption tax. So the key is to not make Social Security any worse than it already is. Social Security is fine for people that are currently receiving it, but for my children, it's a disaster. So Mitt Romney lost the presidential race down in Florida by admitting it's a Ponzi scheme. But let's be honest, it's a Ponzi scheme. That's what Social Security is. The early entrants are paid out by the later entrants, and that's the way it works. And so we're living too long, and that's the problem with Social Security. And so that's just the reality. So we got to do other things to fix Social Security, but a carbon tax should not hurt it. It should be at least keep it as bad as it is, and maybe improve it a little bit. But then how's it going? Bruce, it's like this. There is a guy who plans to come to New Hampshire in hoping to eke out one more victory. All he wants is one more victory. So his view is rather short time horizon. Then you got these other Republicans, elected officials, who have a longer time horizon. Kevin McCarthy, it took him 15 votes to become speaker. He'd like to be speaker for a good long time, presumably, 24, 26, 28, 30, 32, long enough to die and have a building named for him. That's what speakers do. And so, he'd like to be there a long time. He sees the polling data. He sees young conservatives want action on climate change as much as young progressives do. And so he would really like to switch to this longer term view. But he's afraid of that one guy, because that one guy is a death angel. He cannot get you elected, but he can doggone kill you in a primary. So that's where we are. We're Republicans are in fear of the one guy. And so that's our awkward position at republicEn.org. We're trying to hurry the time that we're taking this longer term view. But I would just pass on this hope. 2026, no matter what, that one guy is gone. You might say, wait a minute, Inglis, the next presidential race 28, not 26. The last 2 years of a president's term, if it's a second term, are lame duck years. Presidents don't get anything done in those last 2 years. So he's gone in 2026, no matter what. And people are trying to figure out, what do you do next? Who's the next thing? As soon as that 26 midterm rolls around, the writing early 27 will be, who's going to run for president next? And so they'll be stomping around the snows of New Hampshire early 2027, coming to your house, knocking on your door. But meanwhile, the scientists are ringing in my ears saying, we don't have time, Inglis. We don't have time. We don't wait until 2026. Get moving. So I'm also aware of that.
If I just may make one comment, it's not an expression I've heard before about the person who we won't name Death Angel, but I would send that out to all the other candidates to use as an increasingly popular vernacular. I think it works.
Well, we won't go there in this particular discussion. And the past president is very creative in his own way. So don't write off too quickly how creative people can get things done. I think we have a related question by Wes Tater, who wants you to comment on the notion of a border carbon adjustment. And I think this gets back to my reference to English Industries in Beijing, you need to talk about how this is going to help America. But Wes, you're welcome to unmute and say, state it your own way.
You did fine, Matt. Let's just open the conversation up on that topic and what the carbon border adjustment is. And I'm really interested in the conservative perspective on it, Bob.
Wes, thank you for asking that follow-up, because that is something I left out, isn't it? A big piece that I left out, because you see, I was criticizing regulatory and the incentive approach to fix the English industry's problem, or the thing that I'm doing to society. I didn't complete that circle with the yes, you can tax me for, put on a carbon tax. But the key is that if you do that, then you can apply the same tax to imports from countries that don't have a similar price on carbon dioxide. That's the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And it's the real kicker. I should have led with that rather than only now with your prompting be talking about it, because that's the thing that makes us go worldwide. Because at that point, there is no incentive for me to pick up and move to my operations to some non-regulatory or non-incentivizing place or non-regulatory place, and for others in a non-incentivized place to continue to send in their carbon-laden goods to America, because they're going to have to pay the carbon tax on entry to this amazing market that everybody wants access to. So it's a way of spreading the same internalization of negative externalities. There are probably economists on this call right now are saying, well, he finally said it. That's all he's talking about is internalizing negative externalities. That is that is really the only thing I'm talking about. And yes, I think it is rock solid conservatism. We once did an event at the University of Chicago called What Would Milton Friedman Do About Climate Change? And the answer from the Milton Friedman Chair of Economics was, he'd do a carbon tax that has a carbon border adjustment mechanism attached to it, and therefore collect the tax on entry of goods from countries that don't have a similar tax.
Well, just a comment there. It was one of his associates that actually invented the notion, the model. And George Shultz, of course, who being the statesman that he is and the politician that he is, really brought it to the marketplace.
Yeah.
But Milton Friedman's Nobel-winning associate, whose name escapes me, of course, was the one who first authored this proposal.
Yeah. So,
but the other comment that I wanted to make is coming back to the carbon border carbon adjustment. It's passed. It's real. It exists in Europe. It is due to get here late this year, next year. I forget the exact timing of it. I'm wondering, to what extent is this appreciated outside of a few dilettantes who are looking at climate change, and how will people respond to it once they start to wake up to it, Bob?
yeah, I think it is a key momentum maker, because starting this year, 2023, exporters from here in America and around the world who are sending stuff into the European Union have to document their carbon footprint in the goods they're sending in. Starting in 2026, they will be charged a tax on entry if the carbon intensity of their product exceeds a European standard. And so that's when people around the world are going to be paying to have access into the EU market, and basically having the EU reaching out, using the power of its marketplace to say, listen, what we have here is a worldwide problem. And if you're going to sell your stuff here, we're going to bring accountability for the climate change that you've caused worldwide in those products. And I think that is a very responsible thing to do. It's also something that American legislators and politicians, I think, will wake up to is, whoa, we could do that. And as I said earlier, the big objection now among fellow conservatives is, how do you get the world in on this thing? Got it. It's called a carbon border adjustment mechanism. It gets the world in, because who wants to pay to Europe a fee that you could collect yourself in your own country? Or if we structure a little bit differently, they're doing carbon intensity. And I was just at a workshop about this, and I can tell you that it gets really pretty complicated. But The other way to do it is to say, if the other country doesn't have a corresponding tax, then you collect that tax for them. There are various ways to do it, but the concept is sound in the World Trade Organization and will work if you've got an economy that everybody wants access to, a market that everybody wants access to, and that's us in the United States. So we have enormous power to solve climate change by just saying, we're going to deal with our carbon and you're going to pay the tax, China. And if you think about it, that one guy I was talking about, he could actually make that speech. I wrote a speech for him. He never used it, of course. I published it in Real Clear Energy, saying what you could say is, we're going to tax carbon dioxide and China's going to pay it. And that's not diplomatically stated, but that's the way it is. They'd actually be paying the tax. It forces the whole world to see the interest of saying, well, let's just go ahead and put it in the price of products.
All right. Well, we've got two other hands up, which I'm going to get to in a second, but I think you did address that issue of Inglis Industries and their Beijing office. And I think your analogy might be a little stronger if you kind of framed it that way first. Only because when I heard you say, well, we're going to have a carbon tax that's going to affect my industry here in the United States, I started getting nervous because you're already efficient. You're already paying lots of taxes. You're already doing the right thing. What about your office over there, who's externalizing not just carbon, but health impacts, labor abuses, and environmental destruction? And those things is where I think we draw other people in. Yeah. So we'll talk more about that later, but I want to get to other people with their hands up. I'm not sure who was first. If you know who you were first, you either Wharton, please unmute and pose your question with a short comment.
Hi, Bob. Thanks a lot for the great talk. I just wanted to point out something that I think doesn't get enough airtime, and that is the very broad participation. When you put a tax on carbon, you involve people throughout the economy, from large to small entities. And that's very different from the tax credits that we're seeing right now with the IRA. To make use of those tax credits, you really need a lot of savvy with the tax code. And I think, in spite of the Democrats always seeing themselves as the more sort of the party of the little guy, in effect, the IRA is a piece of legislation where, probably 80–90% of American households don't really feel that they're participating that much in it. And the people who are participating, by and large, are things like my town of Sandwich, New Hampshire, which is, has a clerical staff, and we're looking at putting in a solar array. And that's great for us. We're going to get some, we'll get some rebates for that. But it sort of sends a message of, this is only for whoever wants to do it, and it leaves most Americans, sort of not directly impacted. So what you have in a carbon tax is really
so can you tease a question out of this?
It's a unifier of, it's not really a question, it's more of a comment. So okay. So I see it as a unifier in the sense that it gets all Americans working on this problem. Even just anybody by virtue of being a consumer is now part of actually participating in the solution. And I just want to mention that because I think it's important to say as a sales point for this type of policy.
Yeah, I think so, because it's what I mentioned about the no record keeping. At Inglis Industries, I'm not going to have to keep any record of carbon tax paid. It's just going to be, it's at the pump when my delivery van goes and fills up, I'm paying the carbon tax. When my electricity goes to its actual cost, depending on the emissions that are associated with that electricity, all those things are going to be built in. And there's no record keeping. The only people keeping records are the coal companies and the pipeline companies. And so it's administratively quite simple. And Yeah, so it makes it very attractive in that way. And you're exactly right about the credits. The credits are for you got to be pretty savvy to get the credits. If your town is using, for example, some solar credits, the IRA will make it possible for that to happen before. Whoa, is it a serious piece of legal work to figure out how the town would do that? It probably would do something like have a private developer build it. No, let's see, the city would build it and then sell it to a private developer, or one way or the other. It's a very enormously complicated transaction in order to get it to a tax-paying entity that can avail itself of the credits. But now, with the Inflation Reduction Act, there'd be a way for the city to go straight at it. But still, you're talking about very sophisticated actors getting the credits. And so that is a drawback of that second approach, which is that all those clean energy incentives. And the other is they expire. And when they expire, it's a lobbyist full employment act to get an extension of it. And so that's always the case.
All right. Well, we have about 7 minutes to go, and I'll let people. We've got 2 people with their hands up, but I'll say now, if someone puts in the chat, I'm a New Hampshire conservative, and my question is, I will pick you next. But go ahead, Bob Dewey, who's one of the great leaders within this organization sponsoring tonight. Oh, you're muted.
Thanks for taking my question, Bob. Thanks for that terrific talk. And thank you also to your children for your metamorphosis way back when. And I want to change the subject a little bit from carbon market issues to just how do you speak to Republicans in general? We have, it seems like any kind of climate bill, we haven't had a climate action plan in New Hampshire in a decade easily. And any kind of climate legislation in our current legislature is really dead on arrival. And another one of our board members, Deb Gerson, and I are going to meet with our Republican state senator in the next couple of weeks. We're going to take her out to lunch and chat her up. But the carbon market is a great thing. But how do you get these conservative Republicans who seem to really have very little interest in the topic at all to realize that, before you talk about carbon market, you have to get their attention that this is a subject worth worrying about and worth doing something about. Any advice on that? Or is that interest there, but somehow it's just muted by the party hierarchy? What are your thoughts in terms of how to try to convince a Republican that this is a problem worth worrying about?
Yes, I'm speaking to healthcare professionals, so maybe there's a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a therapist who can help me with this. I think what it is it's 2 things. That state senator may be possessed of, 1, an inferiority complex, and 2, solution aversion is her problem. So first, inferiority complex, she may feel that she's just no good on energy and climate. And when you bring up the topic, she changes the subject. It's like, if you ask me about running a marathon, I don't want to run in a marathon. You ever seen people at the finish line of those things? They look like they're about to die. I used to go watch my sister do that. Oh my gosh, it was not a pretty sight. Sorry for anybody who runs marathons, but I'll change the subject if you want to raise a marathon, right? And so she may be thinking she doesn't have a good solution. And that bleeds into the second observation that we need the psychiatrist to help us with, which is solution aversion. Maybe she doesn't think she's got a solution that fits with her values or that she finds practical. And therefore she denies the existence of the problem. But that's what all of us do every day. It sounds irrational, but we all do it. Here's a plan of surgery for that back problem you're having. First, we can take your head off. After we get your head off, we'll work on your spine. We can put your head back on. Thanks, doc. Feeling a lot better. I don't have a back problem. If that's your solution, I don't have a problem. And so conservatives heard about climate. Is the UN, blue helmets on, is going to come get with the EPA, much loved here in America, and they're going to regulate your very breath. That's what they heard. And so if that's your solution, I must not have a problem. And so you got to help them to see, no, you got a solution. Yes, you do. Do what Milton Friedman would tell you to do if he was still alive. Just internalize negative externalities. That's all you got to do. And the free enterprise system can solve it, the problem. And so build her up to say, you're the free enterprise people. If you happen to be a progressive, you can say, you know what we're really good at is sentiment. What you folks are good at is solutions. That'll build her up to feel like, hey, okay, you need me. And there's the essential thing, is you need me. Because I think too often progressives unintentionally maybe are signaling to conservatives, really, we don't need you. And the cultural power that we're possessed of is going to ultimately overwhelm your temporary political power. And that makes conservatives realize that they've got political power. They certainly do not have cultural power. And so they double down on political power.
Right.
So that's the challenge.
Let's do a time check because we're right at 7 o'clock right now. We do have a hand up, but I do have, as a moderator, I'm going to maintain one question at the end because we won't have you here again very quickly. So Bob, the final question relates to Nikki Haley and of course the great state of New Hampshire. I know I've seen some writing and quotes about her your perspective on her. What's the likelihood you can convince her to join a forum or a town hall on the conservative approach of climate problems and solutions? We'd love to host you and Nikki in person in this September during the GOP primary schedule. Can we count on you to help us get a forum on the calendar with her? You know her that well?
No, I don't, but I would be glad to do it. I don't know her all that well, and I don't know that she would respond necessarily to me in that request, but she would respond to you about New Hampshire voters, because she needs New Hampshire voters, and particularly if she's going to push away from that other guy.
Correct.
On this issue. And but I think that's a great idea to ask people like Nikki or Asa Hutchinson, anybody that's going to try a slightly different lane. I don't think you'll find Ron DeSantis interested in that conversation because he's going to sort of plan on being in that other guy's lane and sort of coming up behind him maybe and then overtaking him. But anybody in the other trying another lane might be open to such a thing, and I'd certainly love to do that.
Great. All right. Well, we'll follow up with her staff and follow up with you and see what we can make happen. I just want to check in with Emily because she's kind of controlling of our time. We're at 7:02. Emily, do you have anything that you want to say? Or is there another hand up that I'm missing or a key question?
I think if you want to give time for John for one more comment, he does have his hand up, and then after that we can wrap up. We
will wrap up. Thank you. Go ahead, John, quickly.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for your time here with us tonight. Ending on a hopefully positive note, you wrote a wonderful article. Carbon price is closer than you think. I pasted it into the chat. I'm excited to hear Republicans in Congress talking about climate change. And some of their solutions are a little weak, but they're definitely talking about the problem, which is a great sign. What do you hear about border carbon adjustments in Congress now? Are Republicans interested in them?
Yeah, and there's a lot of movement. In fact, E&E News has today an article about how Climate Leadership Council has done a great job of brokering some bipartisan conversations, and they are bipartisan about essentially a carbon tariff. It's slightly different than the carbon border adjustment mechanism we were just talking about, but it can accomplish similar things. And there's there's real movement there and interest on the Republican side in that, particularly Senators Cassidy and Kramer and Graham are all talking about basically applying a tax to imported stuff. They have a challenge on their hands, which is they're going to try to argue that our regulations should count as an equivalent to a carbon tax, a domestic carbon tax. That may work. If it works, great. If it doesn't, it gets the conversation going about, well, how could we do that thing of applying to imports a carbon fee? And the answer to that is the safest way to do it is to have your own domestically. And so yeah, there's movement, and it's the momentum maker is what we were talking about earlier, which is a European carbon border adjustment mechanism that is now a reality. So it's wonderful to be with you. Thank you for having me. And
You're muted, Matt.
Oh, just to play off what you said, I know that conservative voices are the indispensable voice within an indispensable nation, and I really appreciate your pro-American approach to how you get this. It's really the way you bring people together. I've been studying climate and health for over a decade, and I'm very hopeful about our approaches to do this. And I think we just need to get out, tell our young people, America has solved big problems before, we will again. And that they need to feel hopeful about the future. That's kind of the link into the health part. You've been a great speaker, and we hope you'll be a great partner in the future. So thank you for your time and all the energy you put into this great issue.
thanks so much. It's great to be with you. Thanks for what you're doing. See ya.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Thank you.
Have a great night.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you.